you, Michael, for being here. Michael is CEO of Sony Entertainment, and he's had a long leadership career. So I want to ask you, what have been some of the principles that have guided your leadership career over the last, frankly, 20-some years in the content and entertainment business?
Boy, it'll sound a little hokey, but I would argue that integrity is paramount among them. You have to be absolutely consistent and true to what you say on a regular basis so that people can rely on you in that regard. I think the other one is that you basically look after the organization before you look after yourself. That's another one that's key, that people come to understand and respect. I think it's, as in all things, typically the stuff that comes on my desk is at a point in time when it's either a huge problem or about to be a huge problem. And so the job goes in ebbs and flows, and the key in those moments is to sort of try and be as deliberate and calm as you possibly can be.
You're the leader of a very large company, global company. And obviously part of the role of a leader is to find other leaders, because they have to be on the ground. How do you hunt and peck for that leadership? What are the qualities you look for that are unique to leadership? Maybe not even ones you have done yourself, but things that you think are important.
Oh, I think there are a lot of qualities that I don't have that I see in others. So for example, I wouldn't argue that I'm a great one to inspire others, but I think it's a hugely important quality in leadership, and I look for people who can do that. And I know I have a lot of people who work with me who are capable of doing that. I think there's a big piece of it that that a leader is somebody who can actually see one step into the future. And when I find people who can do that, and it's sort of like having an extra gear, that's sixth gear, and oftentimes you just see it in conversation that individual has it. And a lot of it is, frankly, just the desire and the ability to roll up your sleeves no matter what the situation might be and do the job. And I find that all over our company. And when you find the really good ones, you make sure that those people are put in a position where they can shine and given a lot of authority.
You're in a business that's really rapidly changing in the eye of the digital storm globally.
My gosh, yes.
How do you lead that change agenda? First of all, how do you change constantly? Mm-hmm. And how do you lead that change agenda in your organization?
First of all, you try and stay abreast of it, which in and of itself is a task, because as you point out, it's changing constantly and all the time. You also want to make certain that the organization at large is not only staying abreast of it, but is organized so that it can take advantage of the situation. A place like a movie studio or a music company oftentimes is set up for a distribution methodology that existed 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or was prevalent then, and all of a sudden today is very different. So you're constantly looking at the organization of the company and trying to understand whether or not we're organized properly and we have the right folks in the right place. There's another debate, which is whether or not you actually want to be a first mover. My preference, given the fact that we're a content company first and foremost, we don't really need to be a first mover. And in point of fact, in my opinion, a lot of people who are first movers and choose to be, they don't necessarily get it right. And so there's a little bit of a reluctance on my part to jump in too quickly. But of course, you don't want to be the last one in. So now you're put in this situation of sort of where in the mix do you want to be, and that's a large piece of it as well.
But risk and reward are so close together. If you're not willing to take some risk, it's very hard to capture reward.
Yep.
So how do you shape the company so it's not risk averse, meaning it keeps moving back farther from the finish line, and therefore it doesn't finish? How do you create that in the culture?
So the big risks, and you know this, Peter, because you've done it a lot, is to be willing to pull the trigger. Right. And the pulling the trigger means either deciding to make a movie, deciding to make a TV show, deciding to go forward with the business. If you don't find yourself in a situation where you're working with people who are actually willing to pull the trigger, then there's no business, right? You can endlessly be a consultant on the one hand, but on the other hand, on the one hand, but on the other hand. So ultimately you have to say to people who you work with, you're only going to succeed here if you are actually going to be an advocate. Mm-hmm. And yes, you're going to be wrong. You're probably going to be wrong half the time. Mm-hmm. But hopefully that half the time that you're wrong doesn't bury us. And the other half is where you're going to demonstrate your abilities. And you really have to instill that in people. You really have to make people aware of the fact that unless they are the kind of folks who are willing to make decisions and put themselves on the line for those decisions, they ultimately are not going to be able to lead the organization.
Sony just went through a horrible crisis, and you've come out the other side. What do you see as your role as leader in managing through a crisis of that magnitude? What do you need to be doing? How do you parse out your role?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. And I've been through, in my professional career, a bunch of different crises, financial crises. We had a very bad one at Penguin. We had a couple of other ones in other parts of my job. But this obviously, for me at least, and arguably it was one of the worst crises anybody's had in a business organization, because we were completely shut down. And it's a testament to the people at Sony Pictures, and the FBI has told me this, that we were that the organization managed to put itself back up on its feet. The fact that it didn't collapse, the fact that we didn't miss payroll, every single television production went on time, every movie start went on time. A lot of it is about making people feel that there is purpose and direction, and that there is a certain set of a calm in the leadership role, but also that you demonstrate a confidence that we can get through this. Now, I will say candidly that there are many times where the confidence that you're going to get through it is a confidence that you've sort of created in your own head, because you're not quite sure of what the path through is. So you're telling everybody, this is going to be okay, we're going to figure out how to get through this, and you are sort of making it up as you go along. As part of that, you also have to be willing to make decisions all the time, because if you don't, what happens is that the crisis overwhelms you. If you aren't willing to make decisions on a constant basis, not in a hurried way, not in a way where you haven't looked at all the as many of the facets as you can in that moment. But if you're not willing to actually come to a decision, then the events will overtake you. The last piece of it is, I think at a certain point, if you're sort of running the place, you have to pull yourself out of the operations of the business and completely focus on the crisis, because the operations of the business have to be left to the operators, and your job becomes about the crisis, whether that's dealing with external authorities like the FBI or the government or the press, all of those things, because you can't do both. You have to make the people in operations feel as though that's what they need to focus on, and you need to focus on getting the organization out of the crisis.
There is the personal face that you portray to the outside, and then there's the inside, the emotional toll that it's taking on you, and the two can be different. How do you cope with the emotional toll internally while at the same time being the leader? Yeah,
for me it's interesting, and I've talked to a lot of folks who've looked at this issue. When I'm in the thick of one of these things, you are so purposeful that there is not, at least from my vantage point, I didn't have a tremendous emotional reaction in my personal life. There was such a strong sense of this is what needs to get done. It's when you're in the aftermath, 3 or 4 weeks later, that all of a sudden the emotional component takes hold in your personal life. And many people say that that's the case, that there's a sort of, I don't want to say that it's post-trauma, but it's whether it's the fact that you're so filled with adrenaline, or that everything is suddenly crystallizes in the moment, and then subsequently you're sort of going back to the more mundane existence of dealing with the everyday. But in the moment, no, I didn't feel emotionally strained.
I want to say I think you did a great job.
Oh, thank you,
I really
Peter.
do. But having some insight into the whole thing, I think that just the way you handle it, not just what you did, the demeanor by which you did it, and the way you marshaled your resources and your resourcefulness showed a high degree of integrity and formidableness. So you never surrendered your leadership to the crisis. You led the crisis and led it to a safe harbor. So I think you did a great job.
Oh, thank you very much.
Let me ask one maybe final question.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. I mean, you've worked for some iconic American companies, and now you work for an iconic Japanese company. Obviously, every company and cultural set of norms is different.
Yep.
But can you point to different ways in which you navigate? Maybe it's just merely the fact that there's a headquarters somewhere very distant from where you're sitting. How is it different for you to be part of a global Japanese company as opposed to a global American company?
That's an interesting question. I think, well, I've been there now for 12 years, so I have a pretty good sense of more or less of how the place operates, and I have a very, I have a long-standing relationship with the company. We understand each other pretty well. I do think there are fundamental cultural differences in the way that a company based in Japan does business versus a company based here in the United States does business, even to the extent to which you have conversations in the room. There is so much preparation with a Japanese company that is done way before a meeting actually occurs than it would be with an American company when the exchange is very much in the room. And it's a function, frankly, of adapting to that way of doing business, which is not an incorrect way of doing business. It's just a very different way of doing business. And I find that if you fight it, if you sort of work against it, that serves nobody. You have to first understand, because frankly, they're my employers and they're the folks who own the company in addition to that. You have to understand really how is it that they want to conduct meetings, operate budget meetings, have expectations of what it is that we present to them, and respond to that in real time. And the other thing is, the more transparent you can be with the business, the more time you can take to explain to them, and by now, they've owned this company for 25 years, they know it inside out, but the more time you can explain to them how decisions were made, what the consequences of those decisions were, and the fewer surprises there are, the better off both sides are.
Thank you so much.
No, pleasure.
Very interesting.
Pleasure.